Thank you, Siddharth. Well, I'm very happy to be here. Just a small correction, I was part of a very exciting startup, Spectral in Singapore. I now am a principal research scientist at AWS. What I'm going to talk about today, though, was done before I joined AWS, so I'm not speaking in their behalf or anything like that. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little different, perhaps, than what our previous speakers have talked about, and that is using entanglement distribution for the purpose of clock synchronization. All right, so clock synchronization. First thing to say is that it's a very classic problem. You know, anybody who has taken a class in relativity gets sick and tired of clocks everywhere, right? You know, it's like little clocks, little play scenarios where they're constantly these things. So let's move that onto a sort of quantum communication scenario. So we have Alice and Bob. What do we mean by clock synchronization? Well, each of them has a clock that has two relevant parameters. One is the time, t or t prime, which is just the label on the clock. What time is it? And the other one is the frequency. Essentially, at what rate does the clock tick? Now, those two things are often referred as clock synchronization, but they're actually distinct problems, and they have two specific names. The coordination of the frequency is called synchronization, and the synchronization of the time label is called time transfer. I should have written time transfer. And it's a sufficiently distinct problem that actually in the US, for example, it's handled by completely different agencies. Essentially, NIST defines the second, NIST decides how long, you know, how fast clocks tick, and the Navy decides what time it is together with international partners. Anyway, before I go into further explanation, just a couple of things. In this talk, we make two assumptions, and that is that the clocks are at a fixed distance and in the same inertial frame, and also that we're only worrying about the time transfer part. We're not worrying about the frequency synchronization. None of these assumptions are necessary, but it just makes the discussion simpler. All right, so moving on. So what do we mean? How does clock synchronization get done? Well, going again back to these little scenarios that one sees in relativity, there is something called Einstein clock synchronization. And the idea there is that Alice sends essentially a light signal to Bob, who has a mirror. And Alice can she can measure the round trip time according to her clock and essentially figure out what time it was in Bob's location when the light hit his mirror. There are a couple of implicit assumptions there, and the most important one is that the light is assumed to move at the same speed in both directions, which is a reasonable assumption, but it is an underlying assumption. Next question is, or next thing to address is, well, why do we care? Why do we care about clock synchronization? You can already figure out that there are plenty of reasons from foundations of physics that make clock synchronization an interesting problem from the perspective of this fundamental physics. And I've listed there a few of them, you know, definitions of simultaneity, generalized Lorentz transformations, one-way versus two-way speed of light, a number of things. I'm going to say I don't really, this sounds very harsh, but I don't really care about those things. I'm more interested in what are the practical applications of clock synchronization? Why do we care in real life? And it turns out that it's just an incredibly important problem in terms of our fundamental infrastructure. Things like synchronizing the electrical grid, cell phone tower handover, 5G, navigation, of course, scientific endeavors like very long baseline interferometry. All of these things rely on our ability to do time transfer between remote clocks in a reliable and accurate way. This is more or less saying the same thing. I'm going to go very quickly around this, but essentially, of course, position, navigation, and timing, PNT, has plenty of applications and defense. And GPS is the current pretty much gold standard of how we do both navigation and time transfer over long distances. So how does GPS work? Again, super fast over this, but essentially we have a constellation of satellites, 4 of which are always in view of any particular receiver on the surface of the Earth. And by triangulating and knowing the times on those satellites, so time transfer, we can essentially figure out our position on the Earth. GPS is about 30 satellites. It's available since 1995. It has the GPS satellites have atomic clocks on board. And it was designed really with a very light layer of cryptography, one would say. So it was designed with a cryptographic layer that allows the service to be denied, but doesn't necessarily protect against other types of attacks. So what are those attacks that one can do on GPS? Well, the simplest one is jamming, essentially a denial of service. This is incredibly easy and cheap to do. You know, it comes down to just really saturating the frequencies at which GPS transmits. The satellites are very far away, the signal is weak. It's easy to essentially prevent a particular receiver from getting the signals from the satellites. This is easy, but not so interesting. More interesting is the fact that one can relatively easily spoof GPS. What does that mean? Well, it means that somebody takes something like a software-defined radio, for example, and pretends to be a GPS satellite while on the surface of the Earth. And by doing that, one can steer the position of your GPS receiver in a way that that essentially fools the receiver, thinking that it is somewhere that it is not, or that it's a different time than it really is. And there are several layers of spoofing that can be implemented, and they have been demonstrated. So moving on, so how do we protect against this? Well, main problem is that, again, GPS was not really designed primarily to deal with a malicious spoofer. So people are coming up with classical countermeasures. Some of them have to do with cryptographic methods again, and others are just physical detections of interference. Essentially, by having a sophisticated receiver and also a model about how GPS signals propagate, one can figure out or detect several classes of spoofing attacks. Now, of course, this is not ideal, and there is a very active search for alternatives or defense mechanisms against these spoofing attacks. All right, so just a quick thing, if you're interested in what is required classically to secure a time synchronization protocol, there was a paper a few years ago about what is needed, and it turns out that the needs are pretty stringent. We need quite a lot of things. We need an a priori knowledge of the expected round trip time. We need a measurement of the round trip time as part of the protocol. We need a lower bound on the right trip time, which is going to be the speed of light. And we need a guarantee of isotropy of the signal propagation. So quite stringent conditions. All right, so the question we asked ourselves was, well, can some of the techniques from quantum information help us with this technologically very important problem? And the answer is yes. And of course, quantum mechanics and clocks have a long relationship. So at a very basic level, of course, spectroscopy and quantum effects go hand in hand. In fact, Dave Wineland, his original efforts in ion traps, they were not because he was trying to make a quantum computer. That came much later. He was trying to make a better clock. So those relationships go back a long time. But that's essentially it comes down to making a more stable frequency reference. A second aspect is we can use entanglement as a resource and qubits as clock carriers in some way. And this improves the noise resistance and the signal to noise ratios. And one can think of networks of clocks that are entangled with each other. And that's really interesting. But I think technologically, it's still quite far away. We need long length quantum memories and so on. Now, a third thing is that we can exploit the time correlations in parametric downconversion and things like Hong-Mandel interferometry for high performance, noise resistant, and pretty secure clock synchronization. And that's what I'm going to talk. Now, parametric downconversion is, of course, the workhorse of many entanglement sources. So it shows up in a lot of our quantum communication scenarios, QKD type of experiments, and so on. All right, so let me start with let's set the scene in relation to quantum cryptography. So if we think of a quantum cryptography protocol based on entanglement, so think BBM 92 or something like this, where you have an entanglement source in the middle, that's that psi minus in the box, and then you have Alice and Bob in their own labs, and they are doing, say, polarization projections and detecting with single photon detectors, each on their side. Now, if that entanglement source is CW pumped, those entangled photons, those maximally entangled pairs, are emitted at random times via, say, a parametric downconversion process. Now, the quantum correlations can, of course, be exploited to extract a secure key, but the paired photons are a small fraction of the detector events, again, in a typical scenario. So the question is, well, which photons are members of a pair? You know, even before we start our protocol to link the correlations between photons detected at Alice and at Bob, we need to figure out which ones are the good ones, which ones are actually coming from our source. And we do that by noticing that they're emitted pretty much simultaneously or to a degree of time correlation that is in the order of femtoseconds. That's just a physical property of these kinds of sources. And we can do, even without any external knowledge of the clock of Alice and Bob, so without an external synchronization, we can use the internal correlations of the parametric downconversion process to figure out which pairs of photons go together. So this is illustrated here. On the top, you have the detection at Alice. So those are just random peaks according to her time t. And you have the same for Bob. So he has these detection events on his clock t prime. And these sequence of detection events one can run a cross correlation of these events and figure out what the offset between those two axes is. So on the right, you see the effect of that, of running that cross correlation, and you see that you get a noise background and a peak. That peak of the correlation tells you what the offset between the clocks in Alice and Bob is. Okay, so let me expand on that scenario. Let's say now that Alice has the source on her side. She just has it in her lab, and then she detects one photon and propagates the other one to Bob. Again, Alice and Bob have different clocks. We don't know the offset between them. But if we brought them together, so just to clarify the nomenclature, if we brought them together, the difference between t and t prime would be an offset delta. That is what we would call the true time difference between the clocks. Now, as usual, the channel between Alice and Eve is controlled by, between Alice and Bob is controlled by Eve. And we have a propagation time between Alice to Bob and Bob to Alice, which we denote as big delta T AB or BA. So what does that maximum of the correlation that I just mentioned, what does that give us? That tau AB is the position of that maximum of the correlation if we were to run it. Well, what it gives us is it identifies our coincidences, but that offset is composed of two parts. One is the propagation time between Alice and Bob, and the other part is the true offset between their clocks. So these two things are inextricably bundled together in this scenario. Now, for QKD, we really don't care. We just need to know which events go together. We don't need to know anything about the clock offset or the distance or the round trip time. We really don't care. This just gives us resilience against actually somebody changing these things. Or if you're going over a fiber, that fiber might heat up and cool down, and that propagation time might change, but we really don't care. Now, of course, that means that just by doing this, we cannot determine that little delta in absolute terms. It comes together with a propagation time. Now, can we do better? Actually, let me just skip this. So can we do better? Well, yes. What we can do is we can synchronize the setup. So we have on Alice's side the same thing we had before. She has an entanglement source right there. She detects one photon, and she sets the other one over to Bob. Now, Bob has himself an entanglement source and is detecting one photon and sending the other one to Alice. The channel, as usual, is controlled by our adversary. I'm going to call it Damon because the eavesdropper here is not really trying to eavesdrop. It's trying to spoof things. It's trying to modify things so that it makes Alice and Bob believe the wrong thing. And the channel, we can define it experimentally to be a single optical mode. It can be a free space optical mode, or it can be a fiber, anything like that. So now we can run the previous experiment where we run the cross correlation, but we can run it twice, one for photons that originate from Alice's lab and one for photons that originate in Bob's lab. So we get two peaks of the cross correlation. And you can already see down here that the little delta appears twice. And we have the propagation term, delta TAB and delta TBA, so time to propagate from Alice to Bob and vice versa. And if these two times are the same, we can extract the absolute time difference from Alice and Bob. Now, we don't need to know what this time is. We don't need to know any distance, anything like that. We just need to know that light propagates at the same speed in one direction as in the other. Essentially, we want reciprocity of light propagation to hold. If that is true, then we know both the round trip time and little delta. So now we have clock synchronization or time transfer using entanglement distribution. Quickly going over the experimental setup. So we did this experiment. My colleagues in Singapore did this in the group of Christian Kurtziefer. I have to say this was done with spare equipment from old things. So it was a really bad entanglement source, 5,000 pairs per second. We had the detectors that nobody wanted and all these things. But this is nice because it actually shows you really how robust this process is. So let me show you a little bit of the results. So what you see here are pairs of these cross correlation peaks, so coded by color. So two red peaks, those correspond to one particular distance between Alice and Bob. Two green peaks, that's a different distance. Orange peaks and blue peaks. And with a timestamp resolution of 2 nanoseconds, you can see there's still fairly noisy background, but still the peaks really are very easy to find. And as you go to better timestamping, something like 125 picoseconds, the peaks, the background goes essentially to zero, and the peaks are just very, very, very clear. With a self-built timestamp of around 4 picoseconds. It was nominal 4 picoseconds. It wasn't that good. Again, really low count rates. We got accuracy of time transfer of around 7 picoseconds. You really don't need to detect a lot of photons to do this pretty well. With a decent entanglement source, you can do this time synchronization extremely fast. All right. Couple of notes on security, and I haven't, I don't have time to go into this. As I said, we are dependent on the assumption of the isotropy of light propagation. So for Damon to introduce a problem or a wrong result, he needs to introduce a direction-dependent delay on the single photons to break the protocols. Now, these photons are entangled, and as they are propagating, they are identical in an undefined time of emission, undefined polarization state, and so on. We have a single optical mode, so it's propagating at the same speed in one direction and the other. We can do a Bell inequality to check the origin of the signal. And the same kind of things that help us with the security of QKD help us with the security of this protocol. Now, one can wonder about the efficiency loophole and the Bell inequality. I don't have time to go into that. Because the sources are at Alice and Bob, you can have a sort of semi-device independent scenario. A lot to discuss in terms of security. There is yeah, and I won't have time to go into, but just a couple of conclusions and further work say that clock synchronization is critical to infrastructure and defense applications. Classical GPS and other satellite navigation systems are very vulnerable. Quantum information can provide additional resources, namely by the use of entanglement and QKD style authentication. And these techniques can augment classical timing technologies, both in time and in frequency distribution. There are attacks, and I'm happy to answer questions about them if anybody's interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antia. That was a very interesting talk again. And you've been working on this time synchronization now for quite a while. There's a question from Peter Koch, which is, without using the frequency correlations, is this essentially a classical protocol? And can exploiting frequency correlations prevent the daemon from spoofing?
So this has a lot of aspects. Two-way time transfer is a classical technique. I think what we end up doing with this sort of quantum flavor protocol is that, first of all, it kind of comes for free if you're doing entanglement distribution anyway. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that many of the attacks that are possible in a classical scenario are just not possible when you are doing this. So spoofing the signal is not really possible if you're going to measure a Bell inequality, because monogamy of entanglement and no cloning. The sort of changing the isotropy of light propagation again is much harder when you're using single photons in an undefined time of emission. You need to break this reciprocity of the channel, which you can do with things like magnetic fields and so on. But you've reduced the 4 assumptions that you have in the classical protocol to essentially 1. So yeah, that is the and in terms of exploiting other correlations, yes, you can do better by exploiting additional degrees of freedom. I didn't have time to go into this.